Very good afternoon to one and all, and welcome to today's panel, the yin and yang of regulatory science in the post-COVID big data era. My name is Dre, and I'm the CEO of SGInnovate. For those of you not familiar with us, we're a government-backed deep tech venture, talent, and ecosystem builder whose mission is to discover and launch impactful deep tech solutions from Singapore for the world. As an early stage deep tech investor, we look at funding emerging technologies, particularly those that are heavily rooted in research, requiring specific capabilities and a high degree of specialization. We believe that these solutions hold tremendous potential to solve challenging issues and to improve lives, environments, and economies in many ways, from food to healthcare. Thankfully, we're not alone in this journey. To date, we've also built a growing community of approximately 70,000 founders, researchers, corporate partners, and various talents within our international network. The third component of our work sees us tapping on these connections and resources to build a sustainable pipeline of deep tech talent to help our startups as they grow and expand. Today's panel looks at a fascinating topic that's quite close to me personally, and that's the delicate interplay between translational medicine and regulatory science. One is an innovation catalyst, driving the cross-disciplinary application of knowledge to accelerate scientific discovery. The other, a gatekeeper warranting safety, ethical, and moral considerations at each step of the development process. One cannot exist without the other, and both play crucial, complementary roles in the safe advancement of patient care, bringing many new clinical therapies and applications out of the laboratory and into the hospital, or bench to bedside, as some like to call it. At SGInnovate, approximately 10% of our portfolio are medtech companies. Companies like Lucence, NDL Robotics, US2, and C-Mode combine emerging technologies in biology, medicine, and computer science to develop solutions to combat age-old diseases. However, from a regulatory perspective, these companies are finding themselves operating in a fast-changing landscape. Advances in medicine and computing are both the cause and effect of the challenges posed by big data. The incomprehensibly almost vast volumes of data generated from genomic analysis and derivative efforts to make sense of it with analytical technologies and artificial intelligence represent both a blessing and a challenge, introducing opportunities for new discoveries and the potential to speed up development and the regulatory process on the one hand, but questions around data management, security, transparency, and governance on the other. COVID-19 has given us a preview of this in action. Clinicians have, alongside engineers and computer scientists, developed new therapies at breakneck speed. But in many quarters, questions remain as to the wisdom and reliability of obtaining clinical knowledge in such a rushed manner. Our distinguished panelists today will be exploring how translational medicine and regulatory science are evolving in response to these new developments and look at what new doors they're helping to open in the fight against the world's most critical healthcare challenges. Moderating today's session is Professor Salvatore Albani, who is the director of the Translational Immunology Institute, which is part of the SingHealth-DukeNUS Academic Medical Center, as well as the president of the Eureka Institute for Translational Medicine. He is also an entrepreneur with a new startup in the wings, so he is perfect for the role. We also have a super panel. Professor John Lim is a stalwart of the public sector regulatory and translational medicine community. Dr. Danny Soon has worked for both multinational corporations and government-linked entities in Singapore. And Leland Keat, who has a long history of commercializing novel medical technologies through her regulatory and quality affairs work, provides a unique US and startup perspective. Leland has also just arrived on our shores, so please join me in giving Leland a warm welcome to Singapore. Before I hand things over to our moderator, Professor Salvatore Albani, I would like to thank our partners, the Eureka Institute for Translational Medicine and the SingHealth-DukeNUS Academic Medical Center for making today's event possible. Professor Albani, all yours.
Many thanks and a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm excited as always whenever we work together with SGInnovate, because it's inspirational, because it gives us a glimpse to the future and the future of food, which is all together as a part of it. Very briefly, 2 seconds on one of the partners, which is the Eureka Institute for Translational Medicine, which is an international non-for-profit foundation, which aims at doing many of the things which our CEO has just listed. It is to identify unmet medical needs and use technology to solve them. So it's a patient-centric, technology-inspired way to build bridges across the gradient of translational medicine in the hopes to induce and create a better future together. So DukeNUS is one of the partners of an international network which Eureka is comprised of. And we have many initiatives in the attempt to create ecosystems locally, where locally is throughout the world, literally from the Emirates to Stanford to UCL to Toronto to Europe. Here in Singapore, we have events like this. We offer a school, a seasonal school, which lasts a week in November on translational medicine. And we are soon to start in January a master in international translational medicine offered by DukeNUS, which is a first in class for this area. Regarding me personally, I have not much to say. I am a lucky person because I don't work. It's a passion what I do. And the delusion is to be useful to people long term. I made a lot of mistakes, which I share through Eureka in the development of technologies to solve unmet medical needs. As Gina said, also, I'm an entrepreneur with the attempt again to translate the technologies for the benefit of people. Enough about me, enough about Eureka. It's all about you. I hope the audience, you, will be making this event quite lively. The objective here was already outlined very well by the introduction. I don't have much more to add, other than to underscore some tensions which are being created by the evolution of things. As we already heard, regulatory science is the cornerstone of translational medicine, and if you will, of clinical development. It is the gatekeeper toward ethical, safety, and the proper development. It is, of course, also perceived as a stifler for innovation. And these tensions between the need to maintain quality and objectivity and the desire of the patients to get new therapies tested and developed soon. The desire of the private stakeholders in having returns on their profit are being magnified by the evolution of technology, where high dimensionality approaches intersecting in many, many areas from genomics to immunomics to microbiome and metabolomics lead to a discrepancy between the amount of knowledge we create and the amount of knowledge which we use. And this is one of the main problems which affects the swift development of technology, the solving of the problems. As also we already heard, there's been, and we are living in a disruptive moment where these, I would say encrusted almost, to use a negative term, practices are being challenged by dramatic needs. And that has led to a revolution in the way we approach pharma development and usage of data, which has its pros and cons. And is a moment to induce reflection and to share experiences. So we have 3 titans today with a very, very strong experience and very complementary ones. They've already been partially introduced, so I'm very thankful to them for being here and for guiding this discussion. To add a little bit more information, Leland, actually, yeah, she's brand new in Singapore, but I see her as a builder of bridges. She's been on the front lines, even despite of her youthful appearance, for a long, long time in developing products in a way that is compatible with the regulations and yet fulfilling the tensions, which are the ones I just outlined. So I'm very much welcome the opportunity to listen to her. John has an amazing curriculum. It takes like 3 or 4 pages. I just say right now that he's the chairman of 2 crucial initiatives for the development of regulatory sciences and implementation science in Singapore. He's also a senior advisor to the Ministry of Health, and he has been also the chairman of HSA. So I think he brings a wealth of information and experience. And Danny, whom I had the pleasure to interface and work with in several different opportunities, is currently the chairman of the Singapore Clinical Research Institute, and also the CEO of CRIS, which is another organization devoted to regulatory sciences. And before that, and he has been on the front line, he still is, on the development of big data for science and clinical science and clinical development. So the way I would like to suggest that we have this meeting is to ask each of our titans one brief question each to give them the opportunity to develop the field, and then we really open to all of you for your questions and answers. I would like to start with John. Good afternoon, John. I would like, in the view light of the introduction we gave, the tensions which we outlined, the need to balance regulation and innovation, how do you think, from your very privileged perspective, this need for flexibility is developing?
Okay, thank you, Salvo, and thank you to SGInnovate for the opportunity to join the panel today. So just to try and respond to that quickly, Salvo, what we've been hearing in the introductions is this kind of tension described between innovation and regulation. But believe it or not, there has been such a thing as regulatory innovation that's been going on for 10 to 15 years. And if you track the global developments in terms of what the FDA, the EMA, even what HSA in Singapore has been doing, there's been a lot of openness to new approaches to regulation because I think there has been a realization that with all the biomedical and technological innovation going on, the traditional forms of regulation will not be adequate to address these. And so, in fact, I mean, things like rolling submissions and what we've seen in emergency use authorizations for vaccines and diagnostics in the last 1 year because of COVID-19, they've actually had a 10-year runway already. And in fact, probably more than that, as regulators around the world have been looking at these approaches, but also have been talking to each other. And so this collaboration that has been going on internationally has set the stage for what we have seen in terms of regulation and regulatory agility in the last 1 year since the pandemic began. Now, what do I mean by regulatory agility? I've got a little definition here, which is not rocket science. It simply says it's the adoption of risk-based, context-driven approaches and regulatory cooperation, which is predicated on sound scientific evidence and information. And here we're talking of non-traditional approaches to quick approvals, but nonetheless, it must be sufficiently robust. I mean, if you think of the vaccines now that are being administered, they have come on at an extraordinary rate, partly because regulation has facilitated that development, and because the developers themselves have moved at an extraordinary rate in 2020. But the fact that we now have them rolling out does suggest that regulators are not sticking to the tried and tested ways, but are allowing them onto the market, as it were, for populations, but without compromising safety, efficacy, and quality to the degree that is acceptable based on the data that is currently available. And so, of course, it does mean that subsequently, as more data comes on, which is why rolling submissions are important, regulators can make more definitive decisions in terms of clear sort of marketing authorization approvals. So the whole pandemic has moved this along. And what is important is that this should therefore not be something that is sort of discarded as the pandemic hopefully comes under control sooner rather than later, but becomes the new normal in which regulators work to facilitate innovation, drug development, diagnostic development, medtech development. And so I'm optimistic in terms of what's happening here. But To facilitate this, there are certain things that must be in place around the world. And it's not just the fact that regulators should be more open to speaking to developers early in the game, which is actually increasingly the case, but the whole ecosystem has to be strengthened. And so I coined it in terms of what I call 7 T's, the letter T, 7 prerequisites for regulatory agility. And I listed them as trust, because that's very important, especially, which is fundamental for the adoption of innovative therapies. There must be transparency. And if we're thinking of medtech digital options for data capture and use, there must be training, because we've got to level up the regulatory capabilities for therapeutic and policy innovations. And this applies both to regulators as well as to developers. The fourth one is testing. And by this, I mean things like sandboxes. And we've seen this effective for telemedicine, for example. It's in Singapore, there has been this move by the Ministry of Health to have a sandbox for telemedicine, which then was implemented in a significant way during the pandemic last year. The fifth one is transnational bodies. That's extremely important because this facilitates collaboration. And over the last 10 years, groupings like the International Coalition for Medicines Regulatory Authorities, in the APEC level, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Life Sciences Innovation Forum, there's been a lot of regulatory harmonization initiatives going on. The sixth T is transfer, because you need to have cross-jurisdictional frameworks to promote things like interoperability and data exchange when you're thinking of digital solutions. And of course, the seventh one is timeliness. It has to respond quickly. So I could go on saying more, Salvo, but I better stop there and we can take these up more in terms of the Q&As. So back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And yes, I would wish that you continue for much longer, but we have, in fact, the limits of time. That was really inspirational. Leland, it's your turn, because you are, as I said, a builder of bridges. You have to mediate what we just heard with the need to develop a product. When we chatted a little bit about this, you mentioned a few requirements, which are not just knowledge. It is awareness. It is ability to developing tools. And so I wonder, what is your perspective in this context, in this very rapidly changing field?
Yes, well, I want to thank everyone for inviting me to this discussion. It is an ever-evolving, changing environment with regulators around the world. And so it's really dependent upon what your company is looking at and going, what region you're going to, what country you're going to. But I feel like the 7 T's that Professor Lim just outlined are exactly what I would talk about, is how to get there. And a lot of it is collaborating early with those regulators. And it could be you're only in one market, or maybe you're in 5 markets. But if you're in 5 markets, how do you collaborate with those 5 different markets? Because their processes may not be the same, and there may be some similarities, but it's important to understand how to collaborate with each individual regulator. And then within a regulatory body, you might have very specific reviewers that like things that are very specific. And so finding ways to adjust your approach to their needs to make your life a little bit easier is always important. And that takes time to get to know those regulators, those specific reviewers. But I do think one of the very specific T's that you mentioned, that trust, is really, really important. If your regulators trust that what you're bringing to them is accurate, whether it be good or bad is the important piece, because if you're hiding things, they will find it, and that will delay you. So it's really important that trust is important, and it also allows you the ability to educate them on things that they may or may not already know. Generally, if you're doing a lot of development in a field that is novel, you are the experts. And so utilizing your information and your knowledge to educate your regulators during the process will find a good way to build a relationship with them as you're getting to the place of approvals. And during the process, you'll start seeing answers come a little bit faster, approvals come a little bit faster because you have that trust, you've built a relationship with them. And it's not just with that individual reviewer, it's with that body. And if they believe your word is your bond and what you're saying is accurate, you'll definitely find an improvement in how you can get your end goal, which is generally approval and then commercialization. And not to be afraid to come to them when you run into issues, or if you have an issue on how you want to handle it. They'll be more willing to collaborate with you on how to solve your issue with them in the manner in which they need to also check their boxes as they're going through their processes.
Great. Thank you very much. And we will go further on this perspective, because I think it's very important from your side. Danny, we also been working together. I know your experience, which is unique insofar you are a scientist who has developed big data in the context of drug development. And now you're also helping on the practical sides of drug development. So I would like to ask you, in this context, what is your experience and vision regarding big data use in drug development?
Salvo, thanks so much. Again, also thanks SGInnovate and Dri for inviting me to this session. And the big data, I think, comes hand in hand with the ability to do analytics on it also, right? So I think when you talk about big data, there's accumulation of that data, and there's the use of tools like AI, machine learning, and so forth, computational components that allow us to make sense of that data. And for big data in drug discovery and development is clearly a growing field. Over the last years, interest in this area has really gone up exponentially. And I mean, just some examples, I think, coming from the COVID experience again, is that you might have recalled back in February of last year, when everybody really was rushing in to see whether they could find some sort of a repurposed drug, right, that could help treat patients immediately in lieu of vaccines being available. And there's this company that we're familiar with in Singapore called Benevolent AI, and they use a machine learning type of approach. They look at literature, data, and then they use something called a knowledge graph, which then pulls together a whole bunch of structured and unstructured data, and then try to draw relationships between drug sort of effects and also disease and genetics. And what they came out from that exercise, so the COVID thing, I guess, became big sometime mid-January. By early February, Benevolent had identified baricitinib, which is a JAK inhibitor used for rheumatoid arthritis, and as a possible treatment for COVID infection, right? And very shortly after that, that data they published in the New England, and then 5 weeks later, Eli Lilly said they're going to launch a phase 1 study, which they did, and this was in April. In June or July, they launched a phase 3 study. And by November, they had an emergency use application approved by the FDA in combination with remdesivir. So this is really, I think, it originated in big data. It eventually went into a more traditional development in that you had a sort of phase 1, phase 3 kind of development. But nonetheless, the originations of that was quite remarkable. And it turned out to be predictive, right, in the sense that this was actually effective. And also, I think that also speaks to the regulatory agility that John alluded to earlier, in that the along the way, if we had sort of stuck to this tried and tested paths of progressing the trials, they would not have gone so quickly. Then if you go downstream a little bit, in terms of medicinal chemistry, you've got or biology, you have a company called AlphaFold, if you know, and that was a company by Google DeepMind, and this company managed to do a protein structure predictions, right, based on primary sequence of amino acids, and that was very remarkable in terms of this ability to make sense of the amino acid sequence and then derive a 3-dimensional protein structure from that. And that's derived again from a lot of data and the computational tools that drive it. And last but not least, and speaking a little bit maybe again to this yin and yang question, is that the FDA late in 2018 actually launched a paper on their regulatory real-world evidence framework, right? And this is trying to establish a little bit more in terms of how do you use real-world data. So it's sort of messy data out there. How do you collect it? What are the predicates for data quality? What sort of data sources you can use? Not only for safety surveillance, which I think is understandable why those would be important, but then incorporate that kind of approach into actual evidence for product effectiveness, which very, very traditionally has always been through your prospective randomized controlled trials, which gets you there. So that's something which I don't think is fully resolved at this point. There are fairly significant obstacles to overcome. But I think the acceptance that the data is out there, it's always been there, but now the ability to look at it, the ability to synthesize, bring it together and make sense of it has become much more real. And then the question is really, how do you structure it in a way that is real and is bona fide and meaningful, right? So I'm excited for this area in terms of use of big data going forward to drug development.
Thank you very much, Danny. Inspirational. I have also some follow-up questions, but the priority is to the audience. We already have a couple of questions. And the first one is actually two of them from Ashish. One is asking messenger RNA is a technology which has been a breakthrough in vaccine development, but is not totally new. It's 10-year-old. So if there was no pandemic, would now be allowed so fast, in short, to the clinical practice? And the second question is, if there is a push to extend this technology to identify cures for other diseases such as cancer. I will be very democratic and I will not assign answers, even though I can guess who would like to answer first.
So is Danny going to answer first?
Sure. Right. So yes, thanks for that. I mean, the answer to the first question, would it have been as fast? Answer, I think clearly is no. There was absolutely a need for this, and so all the facilitation occurred. I think some of the conservatism that surrounding this particular technology in terms of some of the safety aspects and some of the whether it's got a right kind of drug profile because it's got such a short half-life, and then you're putting a lipid nanoparticles. So there's some unknowns, and so certainly the need of COVID accelerated that. There's some, I would say, measure. I wouldn't. More because of calculated and intelligent risk taking, I would say, to advance it. Okay, but having said that, I have to come back to John's point earlier that there's no safety shortcuts in any of these vaccines. All right, just to be clear. Okay, and the second question about cancer, absolutely, because a lot of the companies started down this path for mRNA vaccines was for cancer. I think certainly for CureVac, I've known of CureVac for some time. Their technology was quite cancer focused. I believe for BioNTech also, there's an announcement yesterday that they are going to set up in Singapore for manufacture, and I'm pretty sure some of their pipeline will be in cancer. So cancer clearly, yes.
So maybe I can add to that and agree with Danny. I think if it were not for the pandemic, I don't think necessarily that regulators would have responded so quickly. Having said that, I suppose it's also a question of whether the developers were ready in the kind of more traditional paradigm to submit these applications to regulatory authorities around the world. And because mRNA technology, of course, requires a certain level of sophistication, even for regulators to appreciate or understand, it's not something we would have seen as fast if the more established regulators like FDA, EMA, and the others had not sort of taken the lead in making these assessments. And so I think definitely the pandemic has facilitated this. And I think the whole paradigm has begun to change quite significantly, because not only is there this aspect then of rolling submissions, but parallel information being submitted and a lot of conversations going on between the regulators and the companies as well, which has led to this. And of course, as I said, it wasn't just at the point of vaccines. This whole approach was being taken much earlier in 2020 with the diagnostics and the other therapeutics, not all, of course, that came through, but that conversation is ongoing very quickly. So it's not just mRNA per se, it's basically any new technology or breakthrough where, picking up Leland's point, if innovators and developers have that ability to discuss the data early with the regulators, you can potentially see much faster facilitation. And I think certainly with mRNA technology, as Danny said, because it started in the oncology space anyway, I would definitely see this proceeding on. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything to add, Leland?
No, I think you guys covered it pretty well. I generally would say that FDA is not going to, you won't see this type of fast development with different things without a pandemic. They do have some programs that allow for breakthrough technology. That is something new and different. And those are, you will see some increase in speed. It will not be at the level that we are with emergency use, but we are definitely seeing increases on things that are considered breakthrough technologies. And those are, a lot of people are going for those designations for a number of reasons.
Thank you. So we have a very interesting question from Agnes, from the audience, which interlaces with something which we already just been saying, and also with some experience. For instance, I grew up in Europe. I did most of my professional life in the US, and now I'm in Singapore. The question from Agnes is, we see different speeds in developing and accepting technologies, and in this case, I would say even the vaccine for COVID, in different agencies, depending on country and so forth. And if I interpret the question correctly, is there any way to optimize the process to make it more harmonious? And I would even extend the question to what is going to happen now to travel and harmonization of procedures, opening up, closing up, etc. John, what do you think?
Okay, so I think this is an important question because it goes back to something I sort of briefly mentioned, the level of sophistication and capacity of regulatory authorities in the first place. Now, harmonization efforts have been going on since 1990. ICH, for example, the International Council for Harmonization, has been there for that long. And a whole lot of guidances co-developed by industry and regulators out there in the public domain for regulators to apply. But smaller regulators, and even arguably in this part of the world, would not be able to make those kind of quick decisions on new technology or innovations to the same degree if they're not able, in a sense, to piggyback on some of the decisions of the more developed regulators. And so this whole issue linked to regulatory agility is the aspect not only of convergence, but of reliance. And it's something that Singapore has been doing since the early 2000s, where in fact we do look at decisions taken elsewhere, and then we expedite those regulatory approvals by not necessarily asking for every aspect of the dossier to come through, but maybe in our context, looking more at the clinical and the quality data. And this has been expedited quite significantly over the past year. And so that's one aspect. Convergence and reliance has to come more into play to facilitate this aspect of faster access and regulatory approvals, but also then the ability to really sort of continue working together and share information. And that's where a body like the International Coalition for Medicines Regulatory Authorities that was established in 2014 has been particularly active in the last 1 year, because that ability to exchange information, which is not redacted information, by the way, and therefore issues of IP come into play here, but really allowing regulators to have access to similar degrees of information would then allow smaller regulators in developing regions to make those decisions faster. Now, having said that, I wrote a short thought piece on the issue in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, and clearly we're not seeing this happening to a major degree at the moment, because I think overlaid on top of what we're talking in the idealized state is a lot of social political pressures, and that's the reality of regulation as well, right? And worse still, we see the countries, for example, in this region having access to different sorts of vaccines, so that's even going to be more difficult. So that's a short-term difficulty and reality that we have to live through. But if you're looking mid to long term, the kind of trends that have already begun, I do see continuing, provided we can facilitate this ongoing communication between regulators and also facilitating ongoing dialogue between innovators, developers, and the regulatory community.
Thank you. Leland, your experience spans across various continents. So let me ask you a question. There is a sentence in American slang which says back of the envelope. It reflects the need to think of the end game when you craft a plan. What is your experience in tiptoeing across the various regulations in creating a back of the envelope plan? This goes beyond just the specific topic. I think it's relevant in general for clinical development.
Yeah, so you get that question a lot in roles that I've had, fundamentally trying to understand, when you're going to be able to commercial. And generally, you try to go with a couple of markets that are large and have a fairly extensive review process, because those are the ones that will trip you up the most. And so fundamentally, you kind of have to, it's usually a guessing game, but you get better at the guessing the longer you've been doing it, based upon, the experiences that you've had. And you kind of have to just work backwards to, if you want, and a lot of times it's how we fundraise is we need funding done by Q1 of such and such. Let's work backwards and figure out what that means. In order to get that funding, we need to be able to show this milestone. So here's the milestone. And then I have to work backwards and go, all right, well, if I need 9 months for an approval in the United States, what does that mean I need to have? And so you have to then kind of guess, can you do it in 8 months? Probably not. 9 months is probably what you're going to need. And so you have to figure out where you can ebb and flow in that development process. And so a lot of times you have to run things at risk, whether it be you run your biocompatibility in your animal at the same time, and as well as your validation. So you might have to run things at risk. And those are the risks in a startup that you can take. You don't see that as much in, say, a multinational company. However, you still are also given very hard deadlines, regardless of the company, that you go, well, I still, some things you can't budge. And a lot of that is the regulatory timeframe that it takes to get a submission in to get reviewed. If you're talking about where you have some areas of flexibility, there are things you can do in the United States. You can probably do a little bit more in Europe from a flexibility on how to get things approved. However, that was under the MDD. The MDR is slightly different now. And so I think you're kind of starting from scratch on getting what those numbers look like for Europe. But if you're talking about places like Japan and China, those are not as easy to manipulate, shall we say, as far as their timing goes. And if you have people on the ground, you might have a little bit more flexibility on getting answers quickly. The language, if you have people in country, you're going to have a lot better of a chance to kind of understand the questions. But if you're working remotely and you don't have anyone in country, those are not the ones that I would ever recommend you bet on first, because they're going to take a little bit longer.
So Leland, thank you. As you know, a good part of our audience is small, medium enterprises. Those are startuppers. And how many times we just need to emphasize this point, how important it is to factor in regulatory in the planning back of the envelope. Don't you think it could be in some cases the kiss of death if you didn't do it right? Can you emphasize this to our audience?
Absolutely. If you make some assumptions about a regulatory approval process without talking to someone that's gone through the process or has knowledge of it, you're most likely going to underestimate the amount of time it takes and the amount of resource that it takes. I've worked for a lot of startups, and generally what happens is when it comes time to write a submission, you know, a PMA submission for a class 3 product in the United States is probably going to be 100,000 pages. That's just the fact of the matter. And if you've got one person, that's not going to happen very quickly. So if you make assumptions like that, you're going to have a hard time meeting that timeline. So it really is important to talk with them to understand the needs that they may have. You might need to hire some consultants. You might need a little part-time help, whatever the case may be. You might be in R&D, or you might be in quality, you might be in operations, but you may need to be writing some things because we need you to, if you want to make your deadlines. And if you're running multiple products at the same time, multiple countries at the same time, you need to talk with them on what that really looks like, because everyone has limited amount of hours in the day. And you can try to work 20 hours a day, but you're only going to be able to do that for a couple of days.
Okay, now don't scare them off, okay? They got it. Danny, let's switch a little bit topic. Given your experience, how far do you think we are, or we will ever get to the concept of one patient trial or trial in silico? How realistic is this, and how will it interface with the likes of the regulatory people?
Okay, maybe I'll define this one patient trial a bit, because there are different contexts for this, right? And so you're talking about a really hyper precision medicine approach, right? Where you are very clear about selecting a specific patient with a very well characterized, maybe a genetic profile and or a phenotypic profile, and then applying a drug to that person. I guess certainly, and in a way, if you talk about the trials in rare diseases, you're sort of like there already, except that it's not a single person, but it's maybe a cohort of persons, right? And I think our ability to do that is getting better all the time, right? Because of this the sort of advent of genomics, precision medicine, and so forth. So ability to understand down to a really small level, a micro level, about what the makeup of that person is, and then be very precise about interrogating response to a drug. You can do that, and you can get pretty small numbers into the trial, and if you get a good response, I think you're there. So that's good enough data. I mean, certainly, if you talk about the cell therapies for cancer, right? You talk about the Kymria cases. Then those are really small trials. Nothing at all like what we are used to for registration, right? So I think we are there for small trials. If you have a very good delta with regards to efficacy, and you have a very well-defined patient set or disease set, you are there. Can you get it down to specifically just one person? Maybe, if you talk about some of these gene therapies that have been coming up with well-defined genetic illnesses, yeah, I think you can possibly get there. I guess it's a question of the regulators getting comfortable with that kind of idea. It is a little bit out there. You always want a few just to be sure that it's not a one-off response. But then you can, of course, clearly bolster by, if you understand the mechanisms of that the therapy well, then you bolster it by biomarkers, make sure that the right changes occur along the way, and then that results in some kind of disease attenuation. Then you can say, yes, okay, this looks quite real.
Yeah, you framed it perfectly. Thank you, Danny. Let's dwell a little bit more on this. And I mentioned the in silico trial, which was very emphatic. What I meant was that there is an increasingly broader collection of data from various sources, typically high dimensionality data, which can enable the stratification of patients into subsets, let it be biomarkers, predictor of efficacy, etc. In your experience, the three of you, do you see this taking hold with sufficient speed into the practice of regulation?
Salvo, what do you mean by sufficient speed? Everything is slow, right?
I mean that, for instance, say you have a broad diagnosis, a rheumatoid arthritis, and you can actually stratify it in various manners, from the histology of the synovium to certain biomarkers, and these can predict responsiveness. Still, however, we don't see this on the market. We see take these and maybe you have a 50% chance of working. What is, in your words, the agility? How is agility implemented in the regulatory science in this context?
I think the agility must come down to what we've been talking about. There must be sufficient communication up front, because the regulators themselves may not understand some of these new developments enough. But I think increasingly they're open to having these discussions with companies, with biotech companies, to understand what this is. If it really is so specific as a particular patient, most regulators would say, why bother even going for approval? Because in most regimes, you can have physicians taking responsibility for administering innovative treatments, but then the onus is on the physician, right, to safeguard the patient based on that. In terms of things like cell and gene therapy, in fact, there are a new set of guidelines coming up, and HSA is about to release its position on this. There's a webinar coming up, which we're working with them to organize, which would begin to address how regulators like HSA would take on this kind of information. And a lot of it, I think, does come back to the fact of early discussion, sharing the information with other regulators, and making coordinated decisions following through. But you see, the problem is not just the regulation in a particular country. When you're thinking of cell therapy, there's the whole issue of quality of care transcending borders, quite apart from the cost issues. And let's say even if a patient comes from another country to Singapore for cell therapy treatment, he or she needs to return for part of that follow-up. And the question then is, who is accountable for that? It actually goes beyond just pure health products regulation. It goes into broader qualitative ethical issues. And so I think the kind of issues you're raising would require more than just our traditional FDA type discussion. We need to look at the broader healthcare system to facilitate the use of these sorts of treatments. So I think in very broad terms, I think that's how I seeing it developing, but health product regulators are increasingly open to understanding more about this, and we run modules and courses on this in my center at DukeNUS. And there's a lot of uptake and interest in this now, but it's an evolving field and we need to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. So Leland, it sounds like the onus is on you to make sure that the regulatory agencies understand. How often is this happening? How unconventional are the things you are bringing to regulatory?
Well, so I think it's certainly dependent upon the topics that you want to have discussions with. So, I mean, there's lots of other ways to communicate with agencies, whether it be, different organizations that are having these broader discussions. But if you're talking about a company going to a regulator, I would be careful on going there without being prepared. And so being prepared is really important. And that takes time and generally effort. Every agency is slightly different on what they require. FDA is very specific these days on what they require. Back in the old days, many years ago, I could just pick up the phone and say, hey, we'd like to have a meeting. When do you have availability? And I may or may not have sent them a packet.
Well, what is a phone? You said, what is a phone?
Exactly. But now you really have to prepare a document that discusses what you want to have that conversation about, and you need to prepare for a meeting, whether that's in person, on the phone, or otherwise, to have those conversations, and that takes time. So it is something that you can do, but you have to be prepared for what it takes to have those meetings. And again, as I said, what you have with those meetings with FDA may look slightly different than with PMDA. PMDA, you tend to have your consultations, you tend to have a pre-consultation and then a consultation. And they are slightly more formal than I would say the FDA conversations are. And you just have to be prepared for what that requires. And that kind of goes back to your back of the envelope. If you need to have multiple conversations, you need to build that into your timeline. And it may not cost you a lot of money at FDA, it does cost you money at other agencies, depending on where they are, but it is time and resource. And if you're working on those things, you're not working on other things. So you really need to be strategic about what you want to discuss and when you want to discuss those conversations. Utilizing other forums and other industry groups to kind of get big topic items through them is also a good way to kind of stay on top of what they know and what they're hearing, so that you aren't necessarily wasting your time on broader conversations, and you can narrow your conversation specifically to what it is that you need to get out of those conversations with those particular agencies. But you do need to be strategic and spend your time wisely.
Thank you very much. I want to remind the audience that we are completely open to questions, because otherwise I keep asking them, because I love doing that, but it's your show, not mine. In the meantime, as you guys think about it, I would like to invite the panelists to think of something which we often, at least I certainly, ignore, which is real life, meaning post-marketing data. This applies to implementation science, so what the therapy is actually doing to the real patients in the environment in which they are. But then also goes back, as is a loop, to big data, because it generates another type of big data, which is the actual outcomes in the social and the environmental context the patients are, but also, again, back also to the mechanism of action, the transcriptomics, even the microbiome, etc. So you have very privileged standpoints and different ones. So what is your view? How can the post-marketing data affect then the future and evolution? Okay, John?
Part of it, Salvo, links to already what we've been seeing, right? I mean, it's a bit like the new vaccines, emergency authorization, where they're coming in and being allowed on the sort of condition that companies continue to monitor what's happening in the real world. And that picks up the point that Danny raised about real world evidence, and therefore the use of big data. And increasingly, of course, FDA is leading the way in thinking about this, but increasingly EMA and the others, including HSA, are very interested in trying to think this through, and whether the use of data, which is not the kind of traditional data, can be accepted in terms of confirming, let's say, for example, those products that have been given emergency use authorization, or just facilitating faster access to other products in future, and then going more into post-market monitoring by using a real-world evidence approach. If you ask me, I think regulators are very open to this, but they're not quite sure yet how to take on these various endpoints just from a big data, digital data thing, but they're seriously having discussions. And this Duke Margolis Institute, which is linked, of course, to us in DukeNUS, they have been facilitating these conversations with the FDA, with workshops with regulators, industry, and developers to try and understand more the use of RWE. But a lot of it comes back to how do you translate real-world data into real-world evidence? This whole aspect of curation, quality of data, which then translates into robust endpoints, which the regulators can then have some decision about. This is where the conversation is going on at the moment. So yes, there's a lot moving in this direction, but still a lot of things to settle.
Danny, do you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, maybe just a little. Yeah, just a touch. John covered it very well. So the sort of translation from real world data to evidence, right? That's the critical step, and it's not easy to do, frankly. But if you talk about sort of quick iterations, right, from the real world experience, maybe I use that word, and back into the biology, if you may. Then the COVID example is quite instructive. Like right now, you've got this question of clots, right, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and that's, you know, it's actually quite a subtle signal, if you ask me, because you've got many millions of people that's been vaccinated, and the incidences is actually quite low. But it's only through, I guess, a heightened awareness because of the heightened caution, because of the quick rollout of these vaccines, that they've looked at this, and because of just the large numbers of people that have been vaccinated, and this event itself being somewhat esoteric, is rare, right? So with that, and from there, they are sort of developing hypotheses about what sort of mechanisms are at play here that's causing this, right? I think they've got some hypothesis around it, and from there you can actually then develop a sense then, okay, how do you modify it for the future? You try to engineer out for your vaccine characteristics that may cause this to be prone. Is the cycle of drug development, you know, when you find out these kind of things, and then you understand where things have maybe gone slightly wrong, and then you sort of go back and rework the molecules, and that's how they improve. Yeah.
It is very hard to think of better words to summarize this conversation, what's just Daniel said, because it is a cycle where we learn from our experiences, even from our mistakes, and we build for the future on the next stage. So I'm very thankful to Danny for having outlined this. And I think we are right on the dot. If there are not burning questions from the audience, there is one from Ashish. So he's asking that given that COVID may have a long haul impact on people, is that resetting the real world data? The cause and effect may have a different relationship. Any comment on this?
I think the quick answer is yes, because in addition to Danny's example of the AstraZeneca product, if you see what's been happening with the use of the Pfizer-BioNTech product in Israel, that's really real-world evidence and data coming into play, and sort of confirming the efficacy of the product in the first place, but also the safety. So I think it is resetting things. Now it's a question of whether regulatory authorities can codify this and take it away from just this emergency use context and apply it more robustly but significantly across a wider spectrum beyond COVID.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So Daniel, do you want to say something? No.
Yeah, I'll just say that COVID has generated enough data to keep many scientific careers going for another decade, I think, you know, so yep. So I don't know what reset means, but fundamentally there's just such deep data that's been collected, real world, environmental, you name it, basically.
Indeed, with a lot to be learned in many different perspectives and layers. So I really, I'm very grateful to all of you. This has been, to me, inspiring and instructional. I hope that the audience shares this feeling, and I thank everybody and our host SGInnovate for their attention. I wish you a very good continuation of the evening. Bye-bye then. Oh, sorry, before you leave, yeah, please give us feedback. There is a link here, so we can do things better. Sorry about that. Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye, everyone.